Out where the sky never blinks and the land don't forgive, they left a man to die. Shot in the ribs, horse dead, heat closing in like a coffin lid. But the desert has its own kind of justice, and sometimes salvation rides in from where you least expect it. Story begins. The Arizona sun wasn't just hot that day. It was vindictive. It baked the riverbeds to cracking, scalded the backs of lizards, and turned every breath into a fight. Wyatt Cole limped under that sun, like a man walking backward into his own grave. His shirt stuck to his side with blood. The bullet had gone in just under the ribs. Clean, but deep. The kind of wound that didn't scream at first, just whispered, "You don't have long." He didn't remember hitting the dirt. 1 minute he was stumbling over sandstone, the next he was on his knees, mouth full of copper and dust. He blinked hard, trying to clear the dancing shapes from his eyes, but all he could see was Jesse's face. His brother. Smiling 1 second, dying the next. That night still owns me, he thought. His head drooped. Maybe this was it. After all the fights, the running, the guilt, maybe the buzzards could have this one. Then he heard it. A horse, breathing slow, steady, not spooked. He raised his head, barely. Boots crunched in dry gravel. She stood in front of the sun, outlined like a dream with teeth. A young Apache woman, sharp-eyed and still as a hawk on a fence post. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. Dust smeared her skin, but her grip on the reins was steady as any gunslinger's. A knife glinted at her thigh. "You're bleeding." Her voice wasn't soft, but it wasn't cruel either. Just factual. Like a woman who'd seen enough to know what mattered and what didn't. Wyatt coughed once, grimacing. "Got ambushed." She didn't move. "You dying?" "Not yet." "You will be if you stay here." He tried to laugh, but winced instead. "Ain't got much choice, lady." "That your name? Ain't got much choice?" she said. He cracked a grin despite himself. "Wyatt. Wyatt Cole." The woman crouched beside him, close enough for him to smell smoke and horsehair. She put a hand under his elbow. "Get up." "Why help me?" he asked, honestly. Her eyes didn't blink. "Because I've been left behind before. I don't do that to others." He tried standing. Failed. She didn't flinch, slipped her shoulder under his arm and hoisted with more strength than he expected. He leaned against her, his arm around her waist, breath ragged. She led him to her painted mare. "Get on." "I'll fall right off," he muttered. "Then I'll lift you back up again." She said it like a vow, not a favor. With effort and a grunt that ripped through him, Wyatt got on the horse behind her, his chest pressed against her back, one arm around her, the other gripping the saddle horn like it might save his soul. Her skin was warm where the dress had ripped. She didn't pull away. She clicked her tongue, and the mare started moving, slow but steady. "Stay awake," she said. "If you pass out, I'll have to drag you into the cabin myself." "What cabin?" he murmured. 2 miles west. Hunters used it. My mother once hid there from soldiers." He didn't answer. His jaw was tight with pain. She kept riding. Her voice was low, almost gentle. "My name is Tala." He opened his eyes again. "Nice to meet you, Tala." "You too, Wyatt Cole. Now don't you die on me." And in that moment, it didn't matter that they were strangers, or that death still rode behind them on horseback. What mattered was the hand that didn't let go. The voice that said, "You matter," without needing to say it out loud. The mare's hooves crunched forward, carving a path through heat, dust, and whatever came next. And Wyatt thought, maybe today ain't my day to die after all. Like stories where the bullets fly, the hearts ache, and the desert tests what you're made of. Then saddle up and hit that subscribe button. More tales from the edge of survival, and the spark of something real are just down the trail. The painted mare trudged on, hooves sinking into soft sand as shadows lengthened across the canyon walls. The heat was giving way, but Wyatt Cole's pain wasn't. Every breath came sharp and shallow. His sweat-soaked shirt clung to his ribs, bandages darkening again. But he held on, barely, to Tala's waist, the only anchor keeping him from sliding off into the dust. She didn't speak, just rode steady, gaze fixed ahead like every second mattered. And maybe it did. Wyatt tried to lift his head, blinked at the orange smear of sunset bleeding into the ridgeline. "We close?" "Real close," she said, voice flat but calm. "Just past those rocks. Cabins tucked in the draw." Wyatt nodded weakly, though she couldn't see it. The ache in his side was worse now, hot and grinding, the kind of pain that made a man think about giving up. But he couldn't, not while she kept riding. The cabin appeared like a ghost, wooden, squat, and half swallowed by the slope. Tala dismounted first, then turned back and reached up for him. "Come on," she said. "Don't make me drag your full-grown self off this saddle." Wyatt gave a breathy chuckle. "Ain't no gentlemanly way to fall on top of a lady." "I ain't looking for gentlemanly, I'm looking for alive." With her help, he got down, slow, teeth gritted, and limped the last few yards into the cabin. Inside, the air was cooler, heavy with dust and cedar. A rusted stove squatted in one corner. A single chair. One cot. Bare bones, but it felt like heaven. Wyatt sat hard, clutching his ribs. "You always drag half-dead cowboys home?" Tala didn't smile. "No, just the ones that don't look away when I speak." She lit a lamp. Warm gold light filled the room, chasing shadows up the log walls. Wyatt watched her move. Quiet, sure-footed, capable. She didn't waste energy. Every motion had purpose. He saw the faded bruises on her arm again, the tear in her dress still held together with an old leather tie. She'd been through hell. And yet here she was, helping him. "You got a name for that horse?" he asked, trying to stay conscious. "Paint," she said. "Was my sister's." The words dropped like a stone in a still pond. Wyatt's mouth went dry. "You said soldiers took her?" Tala nodded once, didn't elaborate. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." She paused, checking his bandage. "I carry her with me, not in memory, in movement. Every time I ride, every time I survive, she stays alive through me." Wyatt met her eyes. There was something in her, a fire that didn't flicker. Wounded, yes, but not broken. A survivor, not a ghost. He shifted in his seat, wincing. "That bullet, it's still in there, ain't it?" She reached into her bag and pulled out a bone-handled knife and a jar of what smelled like crushed pine and smoke. "Maybe. I clean the wound first, then we see." Wyatt gave a slow nod. "All right. You stay awake this time." "Wasn't planning on quitting just yet," he said, jaw tightening. She knelt beside him, steady hands lifting the bandage. The burn had stopped the bleeding, but the tissue was angry, red, swollen. She cleaned it with boiled water and herbs, her fingers gentle but firm. "I learned from my mother," she said, voice low. "She was the camp healer. Said pain is a sign you're still in the fight." Wyatt chuckled hoarsely. "Then I must be winning the whole damn war." She didn't laugh, but her mouth twitched. That was something. As she worked, Wyatt asked, "Why didn't you just leave me back there? Would have been easier." Tala didn't look up. "Easier don't mean better. I know what it's like. Bleeding out, praying somebody's coming. Only nobody comes." She wrapped the fresh dressing tight. "I don't leave folks the way I was left." Wyatt stared at her. The firelight caught her features, sharp cheekbones, a tight jaw, eyes too old for 20-something. Apache blood ran in her veins, proud and fierce. She was born in a world that wanted to forget women like her. But she didn't let it. "You could have kept riding," he said. "You still can." She shook her head. "We ain't strangers anymore. Not after that ride." Wyatt leaned back, pain and gratitude warring in his chest. "Then I owe you." "You owe me one thing," she said, finally meeting his gaze. "Don't die before morning." Outside, the wind had shifted. A coyote called from the ridgeline. Long, mournful. The desert listened, like it always did. And maybe somewhere someone else did too. Wyatt lay back, careful of the wound, and whispered, "I ain't got much left, but I got that." Tala stood watch at the door, hand resting on the hilt of her knife, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond. She wasn't just guarding a man, she was guarding a vow. Desert night pressed in tight. Inside the cabin, the world had gone quiet, save for the creak of settling logs, and Wyatt Cole's ragged breathing. His bandages were fresh, but his skin burned hot, fever already licking at his veins like wildfire on dry grass. He lay half-propped on the cot, jaw clenched, eyes dull but alert. Tala crouched by the stove, mixing a paste of pine resin and sage root, grinding slow and deliberate. Her braid had come half undone, dark strands stuck to her temple with sweat. She hadn't slept. Wyatt shifted, wincing as he tried to sit upright. "Feels like a branding iron's still in there." Tala didn't look up. "It's the fever." "Yeah, I figured," he muttered, voice rasping like boots on gravel. She brought the bowl over and dipped her fingers into the cool mixture. "Hold still." Wyatt flinched as she spread it over the angry flesh. The salve stung deep, but he gritted his teeth and bore it. He'd had worse, but not lately. Her touch was steady, familiar even. But her eyes stayed focused on the wound, not on him. "You don't talk much," he said, forcing breath between clenched teeth. "I listen," she replied, then added, "Folks say more when they think nobody hears." Wyatt gave a dry chuckle. "And what have you heard from me?" She finished wrapping the fresh bandage and sat back on her heels. "Pain. Loss. Same as mine?" Their eyes met. No flare of romance. No drawn-out stares. Just quiet understanding. The kind only born from shared scars. A minute passed. Then she said, "You ever pull a bullet from someone else?" "Once. My brother. Back when we were working cattle up near Santa Fe, some bastard fired on us over a waterline dispute." "Did he live?" Wyatt stared at the floorboards. "Long enough to say it wasn't my fault." She didn't press. Didn't have to. The wind shifted outside, brushing sand across the shutters like dry whispers. Tala stood, moving to the door. Her hand hovered near the latch. "What is it?" Wyatt asked, pushing himself upright with effort. "Riders," she said, voice flat. "4 of them. Same horses from before. I saw their dust trail an hour ago." Wyatt's chest tightened. "They find us?" "Not yet, but they're looking. Close." He looked around the cabin, eyes scanning the simple walls, the single window, the weak door. "We can't stay here." Tala nodded. "Not with that fever. You won't outrun 'em." Silence fell between them like a verdict. Wyatt's hand found his coat. Inside, the leather pouch, still sealed, dug against his ribs. "They're not just after the money," he said. "Somebody wants me dead, and they paid well to make it happen." "Then we buy time," Tala said, moving to the trunk. She pulled out a small bottle, clear liquid, the kind that smelled like fire. Wyatt raised a brow. What's that? Alcohol. My mother used it for infections. You planning to clean the wound again? No. Her voice was calm. I'm going to burn it out. Deep. He blinked, then nodded slowly. Reckon we're already halfway to hell. She grabbed a hunting knife, laid it on the stovetop, and lit the flame beneath it. Metal hissed against the heat. Stay awake, she said again, not asking this time. Wyatt bit down on a strip of rawhide she handed him. His fingers gripped the edge of the cot as Tala peeled back the fresh bandage. The air bit cold against the wound. But what came next was worse. She poured the alcohol. The pain tore through him like lightning, hot, savage, unrelenting. His body bucked, legs shaking. But he didn't pass out. He wouldn't. Not with her watching. Next came the knife. She pulled it off the stove, glowing dull red. Without hesitation, she pressed it to the open wound. A muffled roar ripped from Wyatt's throat. Tala didn't waver. She held steady, pressing long enough to seal what needed sealing. Then she leaned back, shoulders tense but controlled. Her hands, scarred but sure, had saved him again. He slumped, soaked in sweat, lungs heaving. The pain didn't stop, but it shifted. Less frantic, more contained. I ain't dying tonight, he muttered. No, Tala said. Not tonight. Outside, the wind picked up. Far off, a coyote yelped, echoing off rock like a warning. Wyatt's eyes fluttered, but he stayed conscious, just barely. Tala sat near the door, knife across her lap, gaze never drifting. Whatever tomorrow held, whatever storm was building out there in the dark, he knew one thing for damn certain. He wasn't facing it alone. The desert doesn't go silent unless it's hiding something. Just before first light, the air around the old line cabin grew unnaturally still. No wind, no coyote, not even the soft creak of sun-baked wood. Wyatt Cole sat up slowly on the cot, every joint in his body stiff and sore, ribs still screaming. The pain was manageable now, dulled by whatever foul-smelling salve Tala had cooked up the night before. But his instincts, those old ranch-born nerves honed by danger, had gone sharp. Something was coming. Tala was already up, crouched low beside the shuttered window, eyes scanning the ridge. She hadn't slept. Not a blink. You see 'em? Wyatt asked, voice hoarse. She nodded once. They're out there. 4 riders, same ones. Moved in before sunrise. Wyatt rubbed his jaw. They know this place? Maybe, but they're careful. No gunfire. No approach yet. That means they're waiting for us to panic. Or they're waiting for daylight to see who's still breathing, she muttered. Wyatt pulled on his boots, every movement stiff with ache. The coat hung off the chair, heavy with dust and something more valuable, Amos Finch's sealed pouch. It wasn't just money anymore. It was a reason to kill. He buckled his belt, strapped on his holster. The revolver was loaded, checked twice. 1 spare round in his pocket. Not much, but enough if he aimed true. Tala was checking her rifle. Quick hands, no hesitation. I count 4, Wyatt said. 1 stayed on high ground. Watchman, she replied. The rest are close. 1 behind the old water trough. Another near the creek bed. Last one's waiting. Leader? Likely. Wyatt moved toward the window, looked through the slats. Hank Dobbs. Tala's expression didn't change, but her grip on the rifle tightened. That name means something? Yeah, Wyatt said, jaw tight. Hired muscle. Did some wet work for a cattle baron out near Tucumcari. Left a trail of bodies in every county. Now he's here, for you. For the pouch, or maybe the man holding it. They stood in silence a beat longer than comfort allowed. Wyatt finally said, "We stay here. They'll torch the place. Smoke us out." Tala nodded. "We wait until they move in. Then we shoot." "That simple, huh?" "No." She looked at him. "But it's what we've got." They went about barricading the door, checking ammo, positioning a second rifle near the table. Tala took the high window. Wyatt settled behind the overturned cot, facing the front. As the first rays of sun crawled over the ridge, the desert came alive again. Wind kicked up dust. The mare outside pawed nervously near the corral. Then a sharp whistle sliced through the stillness. Tala stiffened. "That's their signal." Wyatt gritted his teeth. "Then we hold." The first shot came fast, splintering wood just above Wyatt's head. He didn't return fire. Not yet. He waited for movement. Footsteps, shifting weight, the rustle of brush. Then he saw it. Shadow behind the trough. He fired. The shape flinched, ducked back. "They're probing," Tala called. "Trying to see who's still got fight." Wyatt shifted. "Let's show 'em." Tala's shot cracked through the window. A cry echoed down the wash. 1 down. 3 left. Another shot blasted through the cabin wall, catching the edge of the stove. Sparks scattered. Smoke began to rise. "They'll set fire," Wyatt warned. "Then we shoot first." Footsteps crunched. Too close now. Tala's hand raised. She whispered, "Now." Wyatt kicked the door open wide and fired. The bullet tore into the nearest man's thigh, spinning him sideways. He screamed and dropped his weapon. Tala followed with a clean shot to the second rider diving from the brush. Then came Hank Dobbs. He stepped out slow, one hand up, the other hovering over his holster. "You put up a hell of a fight, cowboy." Wyatt kept his revolver trained. "And I've got a bullet left just for you." Hank smirked. "That pouch, it don't belong to you." "Neither does this land," Tala cut in, rifle steady. He laughed once. "You really think the two of you can change anything?" Wyatt stepped forward, wounded but steady. "We ain't trying to change the world. Just stop you from taking ours." Dobbs hesitated. Just a second. But that second was all Tala needed. She fired. Dobbs dropped like a sack of stones. The silence afterward rang louder than the gunfire. Wyatt lowered his pistol. Tala exhaled slowly. It was over. For now. The sun was just clearing the ridge when Wyatt Cole reloaded the last of his bullets. The air inside the cabin stank of gunpowder, sweat, and scorched wood. Hank Dobbs lay cooling in the dirt outside, his blood soaking into the dust like ink on paper. 2 of his men were down beside him. One had crawled a few yards before bleeding out in the weeds. Wyatt leaned against the doorframe, ribs tight, lungs burning. He'd been shot before, fought through worse. But something about this morning felt heavier, like the cost wasn't paid in blood alone. Tala was already outside, rifle in hand, eyes sweeping the distant hills. "We need to move," she said without turning. "There's one more. I saw him, the 4th. Wyatt nodded. "The quiet one." She looked back. "The one who waits, watches." Wyatt holstered his revolver. "He won't wait long now." They saddled the mare, packed what they could, mostly water, dried meat, and the leather pouch, still pressed flat against Wyatt's ribs like a second wound. Then they rode. The path south was rough. No clear trail, just scrub and stone and sun. They cut across dry creek beds and climbed narrow ridges. The stagecoach road was 2 miles out, maybe less if they pushed the horse hard. Beyond that was Cedar Ridge, the trading post, the job, the truth. But with every hoofbeat, Wyatt felt something gnawing at his gut. Not just the pain, not just the fever. It was suspicion. They crested a hill just as the wind picked up, blowing grit into their faces. Wyatt pulled his hat low. "You ever think this was too much trouble for a simple delivery?" he asked. Tala glanced sideways. "You mean 4 men trying to kill you for a pouch that ain't theirs?" He nodded. She thought a moment, then said, "Somebody paid them. Somebody who knew where you'd be, what you'd carry." "Yeah," Wyatt muttered. "That's what I'm thinking." They rode in silence for a while. Then Tala said it plain. "Amos Finch." Wyatt didn't answer right away. He didn't have to. The name hung heavy in the morning air. The man who gave Wyatt the job, who said the route was quiet, who promised more work after. The man who shook his hand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "He knew I'd be out there alone," Wyatt said, voice flat. "Said he needed a man he could trust." "Maybe he needed a man he could bury," Tala replied. That thought twisted something deep in Wyatt's chest. He'd trusted Finch, not because he liked him, but because he was running out of places to belong. That trading post felt like a chance to lay down roots again. Now it felt like a shallow grave waiting to be filled. A gunshot cracked from behind. The mare jolted sideways, nearly throwing them both. A bullet kicked up dirt just feet from her hooves. "They caught up," Tala snapped. "He ain't alone." Wyatt didn't need to ask who. The 4th rider had brought friends. New ones. Men who didn't care why they were chasing, just that they were paid to. "Cut right," Wyatt ordered. "Dry creek bed'll give us cover." They dropped into the wash, hooves kicking up loose shale. Wyatt twisted to look behind them. 2 riders closing in fast. One had a rifle across his saddle. The other wore a long duster and a bandana pulled over his face. Tala handed Wyatt the rifle and drew her knife. "You shoot," she said. "I'll steer." Wyatt set the stock to his shoulder, exhaled slow, and fired. The shot clipped one rider's horse, sending it skidding hard into a mesquite bush. The man tumbled, yelling curses as he fell. One down, but not out. The 2nd rider raised his rifle. Wyatt ducked as a bullet zipped overhead. Tala pulled the mare into a hard turn around a cluster of boulders, hooves scraping rock. Wyatt took another shot. Missed. "Ammo?" she asked. "2 left." "Then don't miss again." Wyatt reloaded fast, the rifle barrel hot in his hands. Another shot cracked from the ridge above. Close. Too close. Tala's voice dropped. "They're flanking." Wyatt scanned the rim. There, a flash of sunlight off metal. He aimed, fired, and saw the rifleman jerk back. "We need to get to cover," he said. "Stage stop," Tala replied. "Half a mile, old stone walls." Wyatt gritted his teeth. "Let's make it count." The mare charged through the brush, dodging rocks, bullets, and death itself. Behind them, dust rose. Gunfire chased them like angry ghosts. But they didn't stop. They couldn't. The old stagecoach stop loomed ahead, crooked, weather-beaten, and barely holding together. Half the roof had caved in, but the stone walls still stood strong. In this country, that counted for shelter. Tala pulled the mare up hard, her breath steady but fast. Wyatt slid down stiffly, hand pressed tight to his ribs. His wound wasn't fresh anymore, but it throbbed like a drum every time he moved. He glanced back down the ridge. Dust trails. At least 2 riders still in pursuit. "We hole up here," Tala said, already moving to the door. "We can hold them off." Wyatt followed, boots dragging. Unless someone's already waiting inside. He wasn't wrong. As soon as they crossed the threshold, a gunshot ripped through the air. Close range. Deafening. The bullet slammed into the wall behind Wyatt, sending splinters flying. "Down!" Tala shoved him aside and dove left, rolling behind a toppled bench. Wyatt hit the floor hard, teeth rattling, ears ringing. His revolver was up, finger on the trigger, but there was no clean target. Just smoke and the echo of footsteps on wood. Then came the voice. Low, cold, and too damn familiar. "Didn't think you'd make it this far, Cole." Wyatt blinked against the dust. "Amos." The man stepped from the shadows. Amos Finch, the trading post owner. Hat off, shirt damp with sweat, rifle in hand. His expression was calm, like he was settling an overdue ledger. Tala's voice cut through the silence. "You set him up." Amos shrugged. "Didn't want it to go this way. Wasn't personal, not at first." Wyatt got to his knees. "Then why? What the hell's in that pouch worth all this blood?" Amos glanced at Wyatt, then at the bulge beneath his coat. "Land rights," he said flatly. "Territory deed, signed federal. That paper makes Malachi Cross the legal owner of every grazing mile between here and Silver Butte." Tala narrowed her eyes. "So you're working for Cross?" "Not for him. Under him. Like everyone else trying to breathe in this part of Arizona." Wyatt stood, slow and deliberate. "And what? You figured I'd die on the trail?" "That was the plan," Amos said, his face hardening. "I pay a few riders to intercept. Clean. No ties to me. But you survived." Wyatt's voice dropped. "You underestimated the woman who saved me." Tala stepped out from cover, rifle aimed dead center at Amos's chest. "And you're still underestimating her," Wyatt added. Amos hesitated. He wasn't afraid. Not exactly, but he was smart enough to read the room. The balance had shifted. Then hoofbeats. Fast, approaching from both sides. Wyatt looked at Tala. "They flanked us." She nodded once. "We're in the vise." Amos smiled faintly. "They were never chasing you. They were driving you." From outside, voices shouted. Guns cocked. Riders dismounted. Trapped. Tala moved to the boarded window and peeked out. "5, maybe 6, she said. 2 with long rifles. They're setting up crossfire." Wyatt grabbed the pouch from his coat and tossed it onto the floor between them. "That what you want, Amos? Take it. Tell Cross it's done." Amos didn't move. Tala watched him closely. "You ain't leaving here alive with it. You know that." He glanced toward the window. "Maybe not. But neither are you." Silence. Wyatt stepped closer, voice like gravel. "I've killed better men than you, Amos, and I didn't need to lie to do it." Amos raised his rifle, but he wasn't fast enough. Tala fired first. The shot hit Amos in the shoulder, spinning him backward into a wall. He dropped the rifle, gasping. Outside, shouting turned to chaos. Bullets cracked against stone. Wyatt dove behind a crate and returned fire. One of the riders cried out. Hit or ducking, he didn't know. Tala reloaded, movements fast, fluid. "We can't stay in here. They'll burn us out." Wyatt crouched beside her. "Back wall's loose. Might be a way out." They moved fast, dragging Amos's rifle, leaving the pouch behind. Out the back, into a wash of dry weeds and rock. Shots echoed behind them. No time to look back. They scrambled toward a bluff, legs burning, blood hot with adrenaline. By the time the stage stop exploded into flames behind them, they were already halfway up the ridge. Breathless, dirty, alive. The smoke from the burning stage stop still curled in the sky behind them, a black ribbon against a copper-colored sun. Wyatt and Tala didn't look back. There was no reason to. They'd escaped the noose. For now. But every outlaw knows the rope don't vanish just because you slipped it once. It just tightens quieter the second time. They camped in the hills that night, near a thicket of juniper and rock. The mare grazed nearby, her sides rising and falling with slow relief. Tala crouched near the fire, cleaning her rifle with steady hands, though her knuckles were raw. Wyatt sat across from her, one arm cradling his ribs, the other holding a tin cup of stale coffee that tasted more like ash than anything else. Neither had said much since the shootout. Finally, Wyatt broke the silence. "We should have known sooner. About Amos. About the whole damn setup." Tala didn't look up. "You trusted him." He nodded slowly. "I did. That was my mistake." She glanced at him then. "Trust ain't a mistake. Misplacing it is." Wyatt stared into the fire. "He said something before the shooting started. About the pouch." Tala's gaze sharpened. "What?" "He said it ain't just money. It's a land deed, a federal one. Makes Malachi Cross the legal owner of half this damn territory." Tala set the rifle aside, her eyes dark and focused now. "That's why they're chasing us." He nodded. "Cross wants it buried. We're the ones holding the shovel." She stood, paced a bit, then turned. "Then we stop running." Wyatt raised an eyebrow. "That a declaration or a death wish?" She didn't answer right away. The wind rustled through the sagebrush like the whisper of ghosts. "We ride to Cedar Ridge," she said finally. "Finish what was started." He studied her a moment, then nodded. "All right, but not blind." By dawn, they were already in the saddle, riding hard across broken terrain. The route was longer, but it kept them off the main trails. Wyatt's mind turned over every moment with Amos Finch. The handshake, the job, the way he'd smiled like a man already digging a grave. And deeper than that, his brother Jesse. That memory hadn't let go since Hank Dobbs bled out in the dirt. Cole wasn't supposed to survive the delivery. One of Dobbs's men had gasped before dying. It echoed now like a church bell. Jesse was set up too, Wyatt muttered under his breath. "What?" Tala called over the wind. "Nothing. Just unfinished business." They reached the outskirts of Cedar Ridge by dusk. It looked the same as before. Quiet, dust-blown, the kind of town that kept its head down when bad men passed through. But this time, Wyatt wasn't limping in alone. This time he had fire at his back and a rifle at his side. They left the mare tethered near the livery and walked up the main street like ghosts risen from the grave. The trading post was still there. Still quiet. But the air felt different now, like the whole place was holding its breath. Inside, the shelves were half-stocked, the lanterns dim. A single figure stood behind the counter, head bowed, wiping something that didn't need wiping. Wyatt stepped in first. The man looked up. It wasn't Amos Finch. It was one of Malachi Cross's men, lean, greasy-haired, with a scar across his cheek and fingers too twitchy for a shopkeeper. "Where's Finch?" Wyatt asked. The man smiled with yellow teeth. "Gone. Took his chances last night." "Ran?" "Maybe. Maybe Cross didn't like loose ends." Wyatt stepped forward, hand hovering near his holster. "Tell me where Cross is." The man laughed. "You think you're just gonna—" The crack of Tala's rifle against the wood stopped him mid-word. She wasn't bluffing. Wyatt stepped closer, voice low. "You've got one more chance." The man's smile faded. "He's at his ranch, guarded up tight. Whole damn town's scared of him." Wyatt nodded slowly. "Good. Let him be scared of us for once." They turned to leave, but before they hit the door, the man called after them. "He's got more men coming. Heard he's paying double now. Said he wants Cole's body hanging at the gate by week's end." Wyatt didn't turn back. Then he better send more than double. Outside, the wind had picked up. Tala looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You still sure about this?" she asked. He looked toward the horizon, where Malachi Cross sat fat and comfortable in his stolen land. I ain't sure of anything, Wyatt said, but I'm done running, and I ain't dying with this truth stuck in somebody else's pocket. She nodded once. And together, they mounted up, riding not into safety, but straight into the lion's den. The town of Cedar Ridge sat under a heavy hush. No dogs barked, no horses whinnied, curtains fluttered in windows, but no eyes dared show themselves. Folks here knew what it meant when ghosts walked in broad daylight, armed, dirty, and silent. Wyatt and Tala rode in like thunderclouds rolling slow across open prairie. The mare's hooves clopped sharp against the wooden planks of the main road, echoing off storefronts like pistol shots. Folks had cleared out, either warned, paid off, or too scared to stand near what was coming. They weren't here to make speeches. They were here to finish what got started with a bullet in the ribs and a blood-soaked delivery job. The trading post looked the same. Weathered porch, hitching rail, sign barely hanging on by one rusted nail. But now it was empty. No Amos Finch behind the counter. No grinning lies or hollow promises. Just silence. Wyatt dismounted, boots hitting dirt like a judge's gavel. Tala followed, rifle loose in her grip. He pushed open the door. It creaked. Inside, dust motes floated through shafts of late afternoon light. The room smelled of old coffee and bad intentions. Shelves still lined with dry goods. Register drawer cracked. Backroom curtain fluttering slightly. Then a whisper of movement. A figure stumbled out. Amos Finch. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. Shirt half-buttoned. Eyes bloodshot. A pistol tucked into his belt like an afterthought. The moment he saw Wyatt, he froze. Wyatt's voice was low. "You've got 5 seconds to start talking before I let her take your kneecaps." Amos put up both hands, trembling. "It ain't what you think." "Really?" Tala said coldly. "Because what I think is, you sold him out for a sack of silver and a pat on the head from a man who thinks he owns the sun." Amos's mouth opened, but words tripped over themselves. "Cross. He said he'd kill me if I didn't help. Said he needed the pouch lost. That if it reached the ranchers, the land deeds would ruin him." Wyatt stepped closer. "You looked me in the eye, Amos. You handed me that pouch like it was a damn grocery run." "I didn't know," Amos cried. "Not at first. I thought it was just a bribe or something small. But once I found out, hell, it was too late." Tala kept the rifle level. "Then you should have died for something honest." Amos slumped onto a crate, hands shaking. "I was a fool," he muttered. "Cross has been bleeding this town dry for years, buying up water rights, pressuring the cattlemen. That deed in your pouch? It's proof he forged ownership on land he's taxed, fenced, and stolen. He's got men riding for him from Tucson to Gallup." Wyatt's jaw clenched. "Why's it matter now? You already helped him bury my brother?" Amos flinched. "What?" he whispered. Wyatt's voice was flat steel. "Jesse Cole. He ran that same trail for you, didn't he? A year ago. That delivery didn't make it either." Amos looked down, silent. Tala broke the stillness. "You sent Wyatt to die the same way." Amos nodded, broken. "I didn't think it'd be you. I swear." Wyatt grabbed him by the collar, jerking him to his feet. "You tell me right now, where's Cross? Where's he holed up?" Amos swallowed hard. "The ranch. Black Mesa. But he's not just sitting on a porch swing. He's fortified. Got at least 15 men watching every road." "We ain't taking a road," Tala said. "We're burning one." Wyatt shoved Amos back against the crate. "You're gonna help us get in, or your grave will be right here under the canned beans." Amos nodded fast, the last sliver of pride leaving his eyes. Then, outside, the distinct sound of riders. Fast. Not a crowd, no, this was a strike team. Wyatt turned to the window. 5 men, all wearing the Cross brand. a C carved into a longhorn skull. "They're early," Tala muttered. "Guess someone heard we were asking questions." Wyatt handed Tala a revolver from the shelf behind the counter. "Hope you're feeling steady." She checked the chambers. "I was born steady." Amos looked like he might faint. Wyatt gave him a nod. "Time to pick your side, Amos." Outside, boots hit dirt. Guns cocked. One voice shouted, "Hand over coal and maybe the girl walks." Wyatt opened the door, slow. "I'm right here," he said. "Come get me." The call came again from the street. "Wyatt Cole, you come out now and we won't burn the place down with you in it." Wyatt stood in the doorway of the trading post, hand resting near the butt of his revolver. Tala crouched behind the counter, rifle aimed dead steady through a crack in the wood. Amos Finch sat trembling behind a stack of flour sacks, suddenly regretting every deal he ever made. Wyatt's voice cut sharp through the air. "You boys always bark this loud before supper? Or is that just Cross's brand of courage?" A single bullet answered him, shattering the upper window pane. The town held its breath. Tala didn't wait. She squeezed the trigger. The report of her rifle cracked like thunder. One of the hired guns screamed and dropped beside the water trough. The rest scrambled for cover. And just like that, Cedar Ridge was at war. Another round tore through the post's wall, sending splinters flying. Wyatt fired twice into the dust, more for suppression than precision. He turned to Amos. "Still want to sit this one out?" Amos, white as chalk, finally nodded. "There's a back door. Leads to the alley behind the saloon." Wyatt kicked it open. "Then move." They slipped out, ducking behind crates and barrels, weaving through the narrow cut between buildings. Voices shouted. Gunfire echoed. Wyatt could feel the old ghost of his brother at his heels, urging him forward. The town hadn't seen gunfire like this since the railroad surveyors got run off a decade ago. But something different stirred this time. Behind shutters and doors, ranchers, shopkeepers, even drifters were watching, listening. And finally, stepping out. Old Milt, the blacksmith, was the first. He came out of his shop with a hammer in one hand and a hunting rifle in the other. "Cross has robbed us blind for years," he growled. "Time someone robbed him back." Behind him came Clara Jenkins, the widowed schoolmarm. She loaded a shotgun like she was born to it. "They burned my cousin's ranch for not signing over water rights," she said flatly. "Let's see how they like it." Then came more. Men and women with dust on their boots and fire in their hearts. Wyatt and Tala didn't lead them. They simply lit the fuse. Shots rang out from rooftops. Cross's men, cocky and confident a moment ago, were now pinned down, ducking and cursing. Tala fired from behind a horse trough, taking down another rider. "They didn't expect this," she said. Wyatt nodded, breath ragged. "No. Cross thought this town was still scared." Just then, the clatter of hooves thundered down the north road. For a second, Wyatt braced for more enemies. But instead, a small posse of ranchers came roaring in, led by Jed Callahan, a cattleman Cross had run off his land last spring. "We heard what y'all found," Jed shouted over the gunfire. "That deed's enough to hang him." Tala tossed him a spare rifle. "Then help us do it." The street became a battleground. Smoke rose. Cross's men scattered like coyotes caught stealing hens. One tried to make a break for it. Wyatt dropped him with a shot to the thigh. By sundown, silence fell like a curtain. Bodies lined the street, most of them Crosses. Wyatt walked into the center of town, gun still drawn. The people gathered slowly, stunned by their own victory. No sheriff had come. No law had ridden in. Just ordinary folks who'd decided enough was enough. Amos limped forward, still nursing a graze on his shoulder. He held up the pouch, the deed still inside, stained with dirt and sweat, but intact. "Show it to the judge in Prescott," he said. "This ends Cross's claim, ends his chokehold." Tala took it, turned it over in her hands, and looked at Wyatt. "Not ends," she said, "but begins." He met her gaze. "Begins what?" "Something worth keeping," she replied softly. Just then, the last of Cross's reinforcements, a handful of hired men, rode into town. They pulled up short, seeing the rifles pointed their way, the townsfolk armed, united, standing tall. They turned around without a word. The reign of Malachi Cross had ended, not with a lawman's badge, but with the people he underestimated. The dust hadn't even settled when Wyatt Cole knew it was over. Not just the fight, the running, the ghosts, all of it. He stood in the middle of Cedar Ridge's main street, sun sinking low behind the hills, sky burning orange and violet like God had struck a match across the heavens. The trading post still smoked behind him. Bodies had been cleared, wounded tended, folks slowly trickling back into stores and homes, dazed but freer than they'd ever been. Wyatt wiped his brow with the back of his hand. The weight in his chest wasn't pain. It was something unfamiliar, something near peace. Tala came out of the post behind him, rifle slung across her back, braid swinging gently as she moved. She walked like a survivor, not just of war, but of the silence that comes after it, the kind that lingers in bones. In her hand, she still held the land deed. She nodded to Wyatt. "You want it?" He shook his head. "Nah, give it to Jed. Let the ranchers take it to the judge. They earned it more than I ever did." She tucked it into her satchel. "Justice ain't perfect, but today, it got close." Wyatt smiled faintly. "Close is better than what we had yesterday." They saddled up without ceremony. The town didn't gather to cheer them off. Folks here didn't waste gratitude on noise. Instead, they gave nods, quiet thanks, the kind of respect that don't need words. And maybe that's what made it feel real. As they rode out past the edge of town, Wyatt looked back once. Just once. He saw Amos Finch boarding up his broken windows, kids chasing each other down the alley, and Milt, the blacksmith, hammering away like it was any other day. "Reckon they'll be all right?" Tala asked. Wyatt nodded. They will now. They remember who they are again. They rode in silence for a while, the sun dipping low. The horse moved easy, like she knew she was going someplace good. Finally, Wyatt spoke. "You ever wonder what it's all for? The fightin', the losin', the buryin'?" "All the time," Tala said. "But some nights, when I look up and see the stars, I think maybe the point ain't to understand it. Maybe it's just to keep moving through it." He looked over at her. "You're smarter than most." She smiled, eyes soft. "I just listen more than they do." They crossed the Redstone Ridge by moonrise, the valley below stretching out like a forgotten song, quiet, wild, unspoiled. Nestled between cottonwoods and a slow-moving creek sat a lone cabin, weather-beaten, leaning a little but still standing. Wyatt pulled the mare to a stop. "Haven't been back here since Jesse died." Tala slid down beside him. "This where you grew up?" He nodded. "Pa built it. Me and Jesse learned to ride on that flat stretch down yonder." She looked out over the land, the trees swaying in the night breeze. "It's quiet." "It was always quiet," Wyatt said, "but now it feels different." She took a step closer. "You ever think you'd come back?" "Not alive." They stood for a long moment in the hush of crickets and wind. Then Wyatt reached out and took her hand. "You saved me," he said, voice thick. Tala looked up. No, you chose to live. I just didn't let you give up before you made that choice. Their hands stayed locked. Then, as if the land itself exhaled, he led her to the porch. The wood creaked under their boots, the same way it had when they were kids sneaking out for mischief. Inside, the air was stale, but not empty. It waited. They didn't talk much after that. Wyatt stoked a fire. She set a kettle on. Two people who'd bled, run, killed, and saved, now making coffee like an old married pair. Outside, the stars blinked alive, one by one. And inside, for the first time in years, Wyatt Cole sat down and didn't feel hunted. He felt still. Tala curled up near the hearth, the rifle beside her but untouched. He looked at her. You ever think this is what Jesse would have wanted? She nodded slowly. He'd want you to come home. Not to hide, but to build something. He leaned back, eyes on the fire. Then maybe it's time. Morning came slow and golden. Smoke rose from the chimney. Birds stirred in the branches. And the world kept turning. Some stories end in fire. Others end in forgiveness. But the best ones, they end with someone finally going home. What would you fight for? If you knew the place you belonged still waited for you. If you've ridden this trail with Wyatt and Tala, thank you. If you'd ride it again, you know where to find us.